When you think of mighty naval powers throughout history, you probably think of the usual suspects: the US Navy, German U-boats, the Spanish Armada, the Royal British Navy. You probably wouldn't guess that a soda company would fit somewhere in there. But for a brief moment towards the end of the Cold War, it did. The story of how Pepsi came to own one of the world's largest naval fleets is a fascinating one. It takes the tensions between capitalism and communism and stretches them into the absurd. Could a soda company help end the Cold War? And what would a company that makes carbonated sugar drinks do with more than a dozen warships? Welcome to Weirdly Interesting. Today we're looking at how Pepsi ended up owning one of the largest naval fleets in the world. Well, kind of. Warships for Pepsi. In 1989, Pepsi had to find a way to stay in Russia's economy as their rubles were worth nothing. Like the Pepsi Stolichna deal, the soda company had to come to an agreement with the Soviet Union that went outside the channels of typical monetary exchange. This time, the USSR agreed to give Pepsi a total of 17 submarines, a frigate, a destroyer, and a cruiser in exchange for more of its flagship product. Pepsi thus commanded the 6th or 7th largest naval fleet in the world, equivalent to that of India. But did Pepsi take that fleet and begin terrorizing the world's waters? You know, for maybe carrying out missions to sink as many cargo ships carrying Coca-Cola as possible? Not at all. For one thing, the fleet that the Soviets sold off was full of old, worn-down ships that were essentially only worth the metal they were made of. Pepsi offloaded the fleet almost immediately to Norway, which broke the fleet down for scrap. Pepsi and Russia had a more ambitious plan, however. It involved an agreement that would last until 2000 and would include some 85 Soviet ships that actually worked, in exchange for their cola. But then Mr. Gorbachev tore down the wall and the USSR was no more. Russia was fully open for business, and the bartering system that was necessary under the Soviet Union was no longer needed. Pepsi had continued to exert a large presence in Russia, however. In 2020, the company reported some $3 billion worth of revenue in Russia, making the former Soviet Union's Pepsi's third largest market behind Mexico and the United States. Pepsi controlled one of the world's largest navies for a brief period of time. But it's the stuff leading up to that which was so fascinating. It was an exercise in capitalism versus communism. It involved turning a former vice president into a soda salesman. And it involved some of the largest scale bartering the world has ever known: propaganda machines. During the 50s and 60s, Cold War propaganda poured into both American and Soviet psyches. A value competition led to the education system of both countries becoming steeped in patriotism and politics. Lots of everyday things became a competition. Both countries wanted to show that they had superior artists, musicians, scientists, and chess players. They both wanted to show that their system was the best. And to do that, they used propaganda. In the United States, anti-Soviet sentiment started showing up on screen around 1948. That year, an animated film called Make Mine Freedom featured characters celebrating the various freedoms they can enjoy as American citizens. Freedoms like playing golf, dancing, arguing over politics. The 10-minute short film also prominently features a snake oil salesman named Dr. Utopia who's selling a bottle of some cure-all liquid called ism, a clear nod to the ism in communism. Dr. Utopia promises a crowd of people higher wages, shorter hours, and a better life. All people had to do was sign away their freedom. In 1962, the film Red Nightmare was released. It claimed that the Soviets were secretly envious of the American way of life, and that entire cities had been built in the USSR that were modeled on US cities. As time went on, explicit propaganda gave way to more subtle forms. But still, Americans knew who the boogeyman was. Meanwhile, in the USSR, posters began circulating, extolling the virtues of communism and blasting the inequality inherent in the United States. One image shows two young violinists, one in the US and the other in the Soviet Union. The American is downcast and poor, holding his violin despairingly. The Russian is playing triumphantly in a grand music hall. The caption reads, "Different destinies for the young talent in capitalist and socialist countries." American reports from the 50s also accused the Soviet Union of trying to jam up American broadcasts by using some 1,000 broadcast stations to screw with American radio and television signals. It was possibly one of the first instances of information warfare between the two nations. If you really think about it, Facebook's disinformation campaigns and these hate-inciting Twitter bots can even trace their roots back to these times. The kitchen debate. After World War II, Stalin cracked down hard on Western ideals and anti-American sentiment soared. The fact that the two countries had once been allies was suppressed, and anyone who spoke favorably about the United States was punished. However, after Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev took over. Khrushchev took a softer stance on the United States and advocated for a more peaceful coexistence between the two powers. Khrushchev's policies led to an exchange of exhibitions between the two countries. In June of 1959, a Soviet national exhibition was held in New York City. Soviet space technologies, fancy new airports that supposedly were open to the public, and Soviet music was showcased to over 1 million Americans. Shortly after, the American National Exhibition was held in Moscow. From July 25th to September 4th, 1959, a park on the outskirts of the Russian capital was transformed into a playground for American capitalism. Shiny cars, Polaroid cameras, fancy new appliances, and even a model house that every American could apparently afford were showcased at the event. In a little over a month, some 2 million Russians got their first taste of American consumerism. At the opening of the event, then Vice President Richard Nixon and Khrushchev held an impromptu debate near a model kitchen. The televised exchange became known as the kitchen debate. The debate was friendly with a lot of smiling and an extra long handshake at the end. However, the two traded barbs about the various weaknesses of their respective societies, with Nixon telling Khrushchev not to be afraid of ideas, while Khrushchev joked that it took the US 200 years to get to where it was, but it would only take the Soviets 40. Donald Kendall and Richard Nixon, Pepsi's diplomats. Nixon and Khrushchev were strolling around the exhibition. Donald Kendall, who was then the head of Pepsi's international division, supposedly got the ear of Nixon and suggested he offer the Soviet leader a refreshing cup of cola. An iconic picture was snapped of Khrushchev sipping from a Pepsi cup while Nixon looked on and Kendall pours another round in the foreground. The ploy worked. Kendall and Pepsi were able to negotiate a 15-year contract that gave Pepsi exclusive rights to the Soviet market. The dual Soviet-American expos weren't as successful though. Later in September of 1959, Khrushchev became the first Soviet leader to visit the United States. However, the mutual outreach soon soared after an American spy plane was shot down over Russian airspace in 1960, and the pilot was captured by the Soviets. The Cold War remained frigid. Donald Kendall wasn't deterred. He had secured the agreement with the Soviet Union. However, getting Pepsi across the Iron Curtain would prove to be a difficult task. In the meantime, he buddied up with Nixon. Nixon was struggling politically during the early 60s. He had lost the 1960 election to JFK and then in 1962 lost the race for governor of California. Kendall saw potential in the soon-to-be president and soon-to-be impeached and disgraced ex-president, never mind that. He saw a way of helping end the Cold War through good old-fashioned American capitalism, and Nixon was the perfect politician to help make that happen. In 1962, Kendall threw out an offer that whatever law firm agreed to take Nixon on as a client, and thus give the ex-president considerable financial support, would also get Pepsi's business. Nixon began trotting around the globe as basically a Pepsi salesman dressed like a politician. In 1963, he attended the Pepsi Bottlers Convention in Dallas. Then he visited Pepsi plants in Beirut and Bangkok, and dedicated a new one in Hiroshima, where American-made death had literally rained down from the sky less than 2 decades earlier. The Kendall-Nixon was hugely successful for Kendall, Pepsi, and Nixon. Pepsi became an international success. Kendall became Pepsi's CEO, and Nixon became President of the United States. Soda for Stoli. Getting Pepsi into the Soviet Union was tricky. The ruble was essentially worthless outside the USSR, so in order to do business with the Soviets, Pepsi had to get creative. In 1972, they reached an agreement to exchange Pepsi for Stolichnaya vodka, and Pepsi became the first Western company to enter the Soviet market since before World War II. The agreement came amidst what's called the détente period of US-Soviet relations, which occurred between 1967 to 1979. It was a period of increased trade and cooperation. The two powers also signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, a series of agreements aimed at easing up on ballistic missile production. The USSR saw opportunities for helping out its floundering economy by investing in Western companies. Its reform-minded leaders saw the Pepsi Deal as a first step towards injecting the Soviet Union with much-needed capitalism that would lead to more technological development. Eventually, other American companies entered the USSR, including Pizza Hut, which was then owned by Pepsi, Baskin-Robbins, and McDonald's. Kendall was thrilled. Pepsi eventually had 16 plants up and running in the USSR, and began running ad campaigns in the US claiming that its sugary drink had led to glasnost within the communist superpower. Glasnost was a policy implemented in the early 80s by reformists like Mikhail Gorbachev that encouraged open discussion of political and social issues. In Kendall's mind, his cola had helped pave the way for a more open and free Russian society. Michael Jackson and Pepsi on Soviet TV. Later on, Pepsi began an ad campaign within the Soviet Union. By 1988, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Détente had ended unsuccessfully in 1979, and the Soviet economy had been tanking for years. Pepsi wanted to remain in the Soviet consciousness. So, in 1988, it became the first American advertiser to appear on Soviet TV. The ads featured Michael Jackson singing and dancing to his hit Bad, with the slogan, "Choice for a New Generation," translated into Russian, of course. One of the ads also featured an American astronaut and Soviet cosmonaut fighting over a Pepsi while floating in space. The ads ran during a series called Posner in America, where Vladimir Posner, a Soviet spokesman who grew up in Brooklyn before moving back to the USSR, interviewed Americans about their thoughts on the Soviet Union and life in the United States. Tell us in the comments below about any weird facts you have about the world's militaries. As always, thank you for watching Weirdly Interesting. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more weirdly interesting content.